So let's just kind of jump into this. What gave you the idea to look into this? What were your thoughts getting into this investigation?
Well, we had been aware of some concerning levels of closeness between the Hobbs and Mayes administrations and States United. Um, for example, I believe Katie Hobbs, general counsel, had formerly been with States United. We were aware that at least on one instance, she had used States United as her counsel as Arizona Secretary of State. And of course, the conservative world has become better and better aware of the pernicious influence of Arabella advisors and the way that they kind of spread throughout the Democratic Party's machine and are essentially in control of that party at that point. And we know, of course, that States United is an Arabella funded outfit.
What is the extent to this that an outside entity has had this kind of access to our elections?
Well, that's exactly the concern. I think your audience will remember the issue with Zuckerbucks back a few years ago. And now we have this other entity that's got even closer relationships because at the same time that Kris Mayes is looking to indict conservative activists, they're fundraising off of it. But they're also working with her office and actually doing up the indictments for Kris Mayes' office. And similarly with Katie Hobbs and their agreements with Katie Hobbs, yes, they provide her with quote unquote pro bono, i.e., free counsel, but nothing is ever really free. They expect a couple of things. They expect to have policy influence. And as the documents that we received during the course of our investigation made clear, they also expect to be able to represent Katie Hobbs while at the same time suing the state of Arizona or participating in regulatory proceedings by the state on behalf of other clients, which does raise at least the appearance of undue influence. So I think it's something that the public should be aware of and concerned about.
In the documents that you have and that we received, it looked like there were another 20 organizations, law firms in there that were working pro bono, and then about another dozen, about 15 I counted, they had fee agreements. Can you please talk about that? And is this a broader issue than just States United?
Well, sure. Very few law firms will, especially big firms, will do substantially sized cases pro bono. Some are ideologically motivated to fight for the radical left, no doubt. But in many other circumstances, what I would suspect, and what I think the Arabella example gives us some foundation to suspect, is that there's actually a third party funder funding the litigation through these law firms because the legislature has tried to rein in the amount of litigation that is done by Katie Hobbs and Adrian Fontes, of course. And this is their way of getting around it using private donors, private dollars, and then perhaps being beholden to those private interests when they're discharging their job duties. And you can also see that with the way that they had to agree in order to have this quote unquote free counsel. They had to agree to allow public records to be destroyed. And there's even a clause in those agreements that says, and we're not saying that that's okay under Arizona law. We're just saying you have to agree to it, right? These are the strings that the Arabella network then puts on their minions.
What are your thoughts on all of this? When you started getting these documents back, what did you think?
I thought it was extremely concerning that this radical NGO that's obviously got an agenda that's very contrary to transparency to elections, that's extremely hostile to free speech, has its hooks so deeply in to the Hobbs and Mayes administration. I think a lot of us on the right, we look at Katie Hobbs and we go, well, she can't possibly be making the decisions. Who is? And I think this gives us an answer, which is Arabella and States United as a vehicle for Arabella is actually telling Kris Mayes, telling Katie Hobbs what to do, right? They're leading them in their direction, just like they did with Kris Mayes and the indictments of conservative activists. And then they fundraise off of it, right? And the elected officials, the people that actually got elected by the citizens of Arizona to make decisions, those folks are just figureheads for this Democrat spider.
Is all of this legal? Is there anything going forward that even you as a lawmaker, what should we be looking at in the future? What should our lawmakers be thinking about?
I think the part of this that is illegal is the requirement that States United be permitted to destroy public records of its official activities on behalf of the state of Arizona. By using them, what Katie Hobbs and Kris Mayes have done is circumvent or attempt to circumvent Arizona public records law. And you remember back during the audit, the courts of appeals were very clear. You can't do that. You can't just use a private entity to get around Arizona's records retention requirements, public records laws, and yet they persist in trying to do it. And I don't know why, because I think Katie Hobbs was on the other side of that lawsuit. But now that the shoe is on her foot, right? Now she wants to have her cake and eat it too. Argue that conservatives can't get around Arizona public records law this way, but that liberals, oh, absolutely they can. When actually what we need is one consistent law that applies to everybody. And that is not what Katie Hobbs or Kris Mayes are interested in having. And that's especially troubling in the context of our elections.
How difficult was it getting some of these records? I mean, it sounds like some of the records you didn't get because they were allegedly destroyed.
Oh, it was very, very difficult. So we didn't get any of these records from Katie Hobbs or Kris Mayes. In fact, Kris Mayes's public records counsel wrote me a very snarky letter in which they threatened to haul me in as a witness in court in another matter just for having the temerity to submit this records request, and just brushed off most of the questions. And when they weren't brushing off questions, they were lying. For example, they said they had never signed any agreement that allowed for public records to be destroyed when we have it in black and white in the term of the engagement agreement that was signed by Kris Mayes's office. And so we had to go around and get these records from other sources within the executive branch.
For the fake electors, today's story, the documents that you have found, what does this mean for them? Does this mean anything?
I'm not sure what it means or doesn't mean for the alternate electors, except that there's certainly even additional reason for concern here that these prosecutions were politically motivated. As you know, the Court of Appeals, I believe, has said this case has to be dismissed. It's got to be brought back before the grand jury. I'm rather hopeful that Katie Hobbs and Kris Mayes won't do that, because it sets a terrifying precedent, which is if you disagree with the radical left and you try to exercise your right to petition your government for redress of grievances, whether you're right or not about those grievances, that you will be put in jeopardy of being thrown in prison. And that's not the way the First Amendment works. It's not the way the Arizona Constitution works. And Katie Hobbs and Kris Mayes took an oath to uphold both the state and federal constitutions. And I will hope that they keep to that oath going forward.
Just as a resident of Arizona, why can't we get our elections right? What seems to be the deal here? I mean, are we so divided at the top that, I mean, we just have a bad reputation. In my opinion, we have a bad reputation here for our elections, and some of these documents are kind of starting to show that.
It's a culture of secrecy. That's why. Think about it this way. The executive branch is the dumbest branch of government. And the reason for that is that there's a single decision maker. So if they have a blind spot, if something is wrong, or if they're doing something illicit, there's nobody else there with eyes on the process unless they open up the process for everybody to see. But instead, what the Democrats in our state's executive branch have done, Katie Hobbs, Kris Mayes, and Adrian Fontes, especially when it comes to our elections, is that they have resisted every attempt at transparency. They redact things, they censor things, they don't produce documents. Katie Hobbs worked with social media companies in order to censor conservative speech about our elections. And the reason for that is got to be that they don't want people to see what they're doing. Well, that's going to create all kinds of problems with our elections, both in terms of, catching it if somebody's doing something wrong, to something far more prosaic, that nobody's going to catch it if you're making a mistake that's going to screw things up down the line, because there aren't public eyes on the process. The only eyes that you have on your process are those of your insiders and your loyalists who always agree with you and who are incentivized to suck up to you. And that is not a good, robust, and transparent way to run a process. And it leads to bad results, as we've seen time and time again since Mayes, Hobbs, and Fontes got into office in 2022. Our elections administration just continued to deteriorate.
Will you be introducing any kind of legislation to address any of this? What can be done?
Well, I think a culture of transparency begins at the top. Obviously, I'm running for Arizona Secretary of State because I want to set that example for the rest of the state when it comes to our elections. That the example of actually opening things up to the people, saying, I'm not trying to hide anything. If there's something wrong, I want you to tell me because I want to be able to fix it. I know that Maricopa County Recorder Justin Heap has started to try to set that example. And of course, it is something that we're looking at legislatively. That's why it's a legislative investigation in terms of what we can do to tackle this. And I suspect it'll probably be something relatively along the lines of the Zuckerbuck ban, but we're still playing with that proposal.
I wanted to ask you about this last election here in Maricopa County. Goodyear and Glendale both had elections this Tuesday. What are your thoughts on this tug of war back and forth between the Board of Supervisors and HEAP and how this last election was run? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I have a lot of thoughts on that, actually. So the Board of Supervisors ran this last election. They completely crowded the Maricopa County Recorder out of it, out of the administration, basically said, you sit over there and play with your voter rolls, which are super important, by the way. But in terms of the elections administration, they ran the whole election the way that they wanted. We saw how that worked out. It was a disaster. It didn't work. Justin Heap is the person who was elected by the voters of Maricopa County in order to administer our elections. That's what everybody thought they were voting on. That's what voters expected to get when they elected Justin Heap. And the reason that they elected him was because they know that he knows what he's doing. And so why don't you put the guy who knows what he's doing in charge of administering the elections, and then we won't have problems like this.
Should the little guy be upset about any of this? I don't know. I'm upset. It's frustrating to me to watch all this. What do you think?
You, you should absolutely be upset, right? Because people did not elect Katie Hobbs and Kris Mayes and Adrian Fontes in order to hide things from the public. They didn't want that. That's not why they voted for them, to the extent that they did vote for them. They didn't elect the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors in order to fight against improving the administration of our elections. To the contrary, many of these folks ran on fixing what's wrong with our elections and not being like the old Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, being responsive to the public. And then they get sent a great recorder to work with. And the first thing they do is cozy up to Tom Galvin and do whatever he tells them to do. Tom Galvin, of course, being one of the few holdovers from the old board. So the voters went, they changed the recorder, and they tried to change the board, and they did change the people on the board, and yet nothing changes. That is not acceptable. And as a voter, I would be very frustrated. voter has a right to expect that an election actually means something. That if you change the people in charge, you're going to change the way that things are run. And when the voters don't get that, I think it undermines faith in democracy.
What else have you found in these documents that kind of sticks out to you?
I think that the selectivity of the responses is extremely illuminating. So we have letters of engagement, but what gets redacted is what they're about. So nobody will tell us why these contracts were entered into on behalf of the state of Arizona. And I find that extremely curious. I think that the questions, too, that Kris Mayes wouldn't answer are extremely curious. Like, how often do you do this? And who else have you signed these agreements with that allow them to destroy Arizona public records? So it's essentially covering up a cover up. And I think that's something that the public ought to be concerned about, that transparency watchdogs who have held conservatives to account, like, for example, American Oversight, ought to be digging into. Of course, we know that they won't, but fortunately, we do have some great groups on the conservative side of the aisle, and I'm hopeful that they will do some digging of their own. Transparency is the foundation of trust in our elections process. I find it so extremely hubristic for somebody to get elected by voters. They work for those voters because the voters are the boss. They're the people who hire and fire you. And then to turn around and tell your boss, I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing on your behalf. That kind of arrogance is not in keeping with the Arizona spirit of public service. It's time for change at the top in terms of how we administer our elections. And I think myself, Andy Biggs, will certainly be a major component